Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is The Sea and the Jungle. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of The Sea and the Jungle with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. The Sea and the Jungle is a 1912 travelogue of a voyage up the Amazon River, written by an English journalist, Henry Major Tomlinson. Tomlinson was an English journalist and an anti-war and travel writer. The Sea and the Jungle was his first and most successful work, followed by many others not so successful. I know of Tomlinson because he was an acquaintance of V.S. Pritchett, who I consider one of the best 20th century English writers. Unfortunately, all of his books seem to be out of print today. Pritchett, who himself did a lot of travel writing, liked and highly recommended The Sea and the Jungle for anyone interested in travel literature. What is The Sea and the Jungle about? It is about a faraway and unplanned journey sparked by a long, repetitive routine and a need for a change. The decision seemed spontaneously, but it was brewing for a long time. It is a journey to satisfy one's curiosity, but in the end to teach appreciation for what one has. A trip by an average man up the Amazon River, before the luxury, air-conditioned scenic cruises, when it was dangerous and took effort to travel. A bit of the plot. The book begins on a typical November morning in London in the early 20th century, when the author, H.M. Tomlinson, is heading to the office he works at to spend one more day of his life doing the same repetitive task he has done for years. I have a clear memory of the newspapers as they were that morning. I had a sheaf of them, for it is my melancholy business to know what each is saying. I learned that there were dark and portentous matters, not actually with us, but looming, each already rather larger than a man's hand. If certain things happened, said one half the papers, ruin stared us in the face. If those things did not happen, said the other half, ruin stared us in the face. No way appeared out of it. You paid your halfpenny and were damned either way. In the train, which according to the writer never takes you outside the city, he meets a sailor who tells him about his immediate plans, a pioneering journey up the Amazon River, and asks him to come along. The idea seems ridiculous at first, but as he deliberates over it, he arrives at the conclusion that the only reasonable decision is to go. We stood in Fleet Street later, interrupting the tide. The noise of the traffic came to me from afar, for the sailor was telling me he was sailing soon, and that he was taking his vessel on an experimental voyage through the tropical forests of the Amazon. He was going to Pará and thence up the mainstream as far as Manaus, and would then attempt to reach a point on the Madeira River near Bolivia, 800 miles above its junction with the Great River. It would be a noble journey. They would see Óbidos and Santarém, and the foliage would brush the rigging at times, so narrow would be the way, and where they anchored at night, the jaguars would come to drink. As I listened, my pipe went out. Tomlinson enlists on a steamer Capella, and a week later kisses his wife and kids goodbye and heads across the Atlantic. The first stop is in Belém de Pará, at the mouth of the Amazon, and from there they sail up the river, passing through the before-mentioned settlements of Santarém and Óbidos, and then they go up one of the main tributaries of the Amazon, Rio Madeira. Finally, the ship arrives at its destination, a construction outpost for the infamous Madeira Mamoré rail project. After months spent in the middle of the jungle, dealing with diseases, insects, and wild hostile Indians, The Capella, with its crew, heads back to England. The ship makes stops in Barbados and Tampa, from where the author decides to travel by himself. He says goodbye to the crew multiple times in a variety of bars and takes a train to New York and then a passenger ship back to England. And that's the basic plot. What are my thoughts about the sea and the jungle? The book gives interesting descriptions and details, but I found it a bit dry and slow moving. Perhaps because the author lacks literary talent of writers like Somerset Maugham or Graham Greene. This being said, there are some profound personal reflections. What I found most interesting are the analysis of the reasons one would want to take such an eccentric trip. It was the book's dedication to those who didn't go that got me interested in it, besides my curiosity about the Amazon and travel in the old days. In the first part, while crossing the Atlantic, the author describes life at sea in the early 20th century British Merchant Navy, its monotony and difficulty. He says, "I love the sea," said once beautiful woman to me when we were standing on the shore high above it and looking at it. I loved it back then too. I think people create this romantic illusion about the sea. I think people create this romantic illusion about the sea when watching it from a distance or reading about it. In general, we usually idealize or demonize things we don't have personal, tangible experiences with. Somewhat contrary to the ship, which at the moment he describes is pretty tangible. He uses feminine terms and refers to it as she. It was a pretty common sea custom, maybe still is, to personify the ship, since the life and survival of a sailor depended on it. Tomlinson gives a profile of the crew and retells some sea tales he hears. He also talks about sea customs and habits, which some he finds strange, such as sleeping during a day. He says Englishmen don't sleep when there is sunlight, and this habit made them a hard and prosperous nation. He also observes a sandwich, which is black because it is covered with cockroaches, and the maid comes in, indifferently shakes the cockroaches off, and happily eats it. In general, the voyage across the Atlantic is long, and he is bored and somewhat disappointed. I began to see what I had done. I had changed the mark of winter in London for the discomforts of the dog days. I had come thousands of miles to see the thermometer rise. Where are the Spanish Main, the Guyanas, and the Brazils? At last I had discovered them. I found their true bearings. They are in Raleigh's Golden City of Manoa, in Barney's Buccaneers of America, with Drake, Humboldt, Bates, and Wallace. And I had left them all at home. We borrow the light of an observant and imaginative traveler and see the foreign land bright with his aura, and we think it is the country which shines. The places we know from reading are usually not as good as we imagine them, nor as bad. Our imagination is larger than reality and is responsible for a lot of disappointments when confronted with the real thing. After leaving Belém de Pará, which is the entrance point to the Amazon and is located on one of the side channels of the river's delta, he anxiously looks forward to seeing the wide expanse of the Amazon River, only to be told they have been sailing on it for hours. The real width of the lower Amazon can be rarely seen because of the countless number of the small islands between the two banks. On the way to Capella's final destination, Tomlinson gives a detailed description of the river and changing fauna and flora, and it seems to be finally approaching a bit what he imagined and expected. Beyond the river Xingu, on the main stream, the forest, persistent as a presence, again changed its aspect. It was ragged and shapeless and impenetrable tangle, its fronts strewn with fallen trees, the vision of utter desolation. By Obydos it was more aerial and shapely again, but not of that light and soaring grace of the Narrows. It was contained, yet mounted not in straight lines, as in the country of the palms, but in convex masses. Here on the lower Madeira, the forest seems of the nature intermediate between the rolling structure of the growth by Obydos and the grace of the palm groves in the Asturian region of the Narrows. It is barbaric and splendid. Today, some of it might be difficult to see from the main river, since a lot of the banks have been deforested, and you have to go on to the smaller tributaries to get the full impact of the Amazon's fauna and flora. And even this is becoming more difficult to find. Who knows how long before nothing but sporadic stems of trees is all that is left of the majestic forest. Even Tomlinson, in a somewhat prophetic manner, warns about traveling along the river in the future and not seeing what he saw, since civilization would probably have already done its damage. Back then, the only visible activity were small clearings where rubber collectors erected their huts. Once Tomlinson arrives in the ship's final destination, a work outpost in the southwest corner of the Brazilian Amazon, a couple thousand miles up the river near the Bolivian border, the story becomes a bit more interesting. The narration takes place during the work on the infamous Madeira-Mamoré Railroad, which in difficulty and casualty rate can be compared to the building of the Panama Canal, being constructed at that time as well. The reason for the railroad was to bring Bolivia's raw materials to the American and British markets. Bolivia used to have access to the Pacific, but it lost it in the war with Chile, and besides, transporting the raw materials over the Andes was more difficult than going downriver, and the best markets back then were still located on the Atlantic. The problem was that the rivers in this part of the Amazon are full of rapids and not very navigable, so the solution was to build a couple of 100 miles of railroad to bypass the difficult terrain. The project was never completed, and some estimates of the casualties go as high as 30,000, mostly killed by malaria but also by wild Indians. Many of the workers were attracted to the project by dishonest advertisement and unfulfilled promises. They were Poles, I think. Afterwards, I learned some hundreds of these men had been collected for us somewhere by a clever, business-like recruiting agent who promised each poor wretch a profitable time in the Garden of Eden. Many of them probably lived in poverty and miserable conditions back home, and must have imagined the place on the other side of the world, about which they were oblivious, as a new Klondike. Instead, they found themselves in a hostile place with high possibility of dying and little chance of improving their life, and no escape, cut off from the civilized world by thousands of miles of dangerous and impenetrable forest. Some of them tried to escape. I don't know if they were ignorant or brave, probably both. A dangerous mix responsible for many deadly adventures. It was somewhat of their escape from Alcatraz. Next day they had gone. Yes, actually, the poor devils. They had gone, with the exception of a few with the fever. They had taken to the darkness around us to find a way to the coast. Talk of the babes in the wood. The men had no food, no guide, and had they known the right direction, they could not have followed it. If the company did not take you out of that land, you stayed there, and if the company did not feed you there, you died. No creature could leave that clearing and survive unless I willed it. The forest and the river kept my men together as effectively as though they were marooned without a boat on a deep-sea island. Those men were never heard of again. Nobody was to blame. Whom could you blame? The company did not desire their death. Simply not knowing what they were doing, those poor fellows walked into the invisible moving machinery of the job, not knowing it was there, and were mutilated. To give you an idea how remote and wild this part of the Amazon was, a couple of decades later, famous British explorer Percy Fawcett, together with his son and friend, disappeared a bit to the east of Rio Madeira, I think between the rivers Tapajós and Xingu. To this day, nobody knows what happened to the expedition, even though various efforts were made over the years to resolve the mystery. The most likely scenario is that they were killed by the Indians. The area is famous for its aggressive and isolated native tribes, many of which didn't see any white people until the latter part of the 20th century. Tomlinson's stay in the Amazon coincided with the last years of the rubber boom, which brought a lot of wealth to the whites and gave them almost absolute power over the natives, who only received violence and misery as a compensation for their service. The events are comparable to what was happening in the Belgian Congo about the same time, and it brings to mind Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The river, flowing through a remote and mysterious jungle, populated with wild and dangerous natives, and a few white men somewhat lost and frightened by the place, but willing to take advantage of it. The book doesn't have the brutal descriptions and the psychological depth of the Conrad's novel, maybe because it is a travelogue and not a novel. But when reading it, I thought about Heart of Darkness and how the Tomlinson's post and the Amazon rubber boom could serve as an inspiration for another version of it. A few days later, another raft floated by, close in, with 6 men laying upon it. They were headless. Somewhere the savages had caught them asleep. No, I was not affected as much as you might think. I began to look upon it all with insensitive serenity. To sum it up, if you like descriptions of faraway, exotic places, especially from a historic perspective, then The Sea and the Jungle is an interesting book to read. But if you like to hear more personal adventures, then you might be disappointed. There are a few interesting stories, but they are told to the writer. The book's importance is that it gives a peek into a place which for most is unknown and holds a lot of mystery, and the world that is no more, swallowed by the progress of civilization. I read somewhere that in the Amazon there are only 2 good days. The first day when one enters green paradise, and the last day when one is leaving the green hell. I wonder how true and personal this statement is. And is it relevant today? Probably not anymore. For those interested in the Amazon, the first successful descent down the river from its source waters in the Peruvian Andes all the way to the Atlantic was done by a Spanish conquistador, Francisco de Orleana, almost 400 years before. There is a good book about it titled River of Darkness. Also, there is a German film titled Aguirre, the Red of God, done by a famous duo, director Werner Herzog and actor Klaus Kinski, with the plot being a mix of the Orleana's expedition and latter one by Lope de Aguirre. The film is somewhat of a cult classic, with an excellent performance from Kinski, and I enjoyed watching it. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paperback which I transformed into hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A naturally tan hide I buy from a tanner in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First, I designed the cover, and what I did here, I used this 19th century painting of a tropical riverbank somewhere in the Amazon basin, with the beautiful and even romantic flora, bringing to mind the Garden of Eden, and probably to many people an image of the Amazon jungle they have in their heads. This is the bag with the blurb, and inside the front cover I printed a quote from the book. If you would like to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather-bound hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make a maximum of 100 copies of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and desire to do it. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100 but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel, and for every 100 donations I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. And one more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.